Savannah in 1945 felt familiar in the ways that matter. People walked their dogs in the parks, clocked in for shifts, and returned to porches where neighbors knew each other by name. The East Side moved on reliable routines, the kind that make a city feel steady even when the lights fade and the marsh air turns cool. Downtown still carried its old weight, the past sitting just beneath your feet, and the streets looked like they always had. Then a single morning disrupted that certainty and made ordinary blocks feel strange. What followed did not become a headline most people remember, but it should have. The case began on a quiet street and pulled police, families, and reporters into a story that touched more homes than anyone could expect it. It's a forgotten chapter written in the middle of familiar neighborhoods, where the suspect could have blended into any crowd. To understand how an unremarkable morning turned into a defining investigation, we have to start at the beginning and keep our focus on what can be proven. So, let's go behind the headlines. On one crisp October 1945 morning in Savannah, Georgia, a man named Roger Kersey, who lived at 1310 East 38th Street, was walking his beloved pooch. This is a normal occurrence in most dog owners' everyday lives, but this morning for Roger, it was anything but normal. He took his regular route, but his dog, Ever Bright, sniffed out something no one wants to find. Roger initially thought they had stumbled upon a snake nest, but the reality was much worse. The dog jumped back from his finding, and Roger looked a little closer to investigate. But, boy, I'm sure he wished he hadn't. Instead of fighting off some snakes, Roger and his dog stumbled upon a human leg, not attached to a body, just the leg. It was foul, having been there for a few days, and the blood spatter had oxidized. Roger, horrified, rushes home and calls the police from his landline, because remember, it's 1945. It was either that he ran home or ran to the police station, or tried to flag someone else down who could help. The call is answered, and the Savannah police responded very quickly. Savannah may have a bit of a creepy history, but finding dismembered legs was not a common occurrence. So Detective Chief John McCarthy, along with other detectives, Fitzgerald, Brennan, and Perkins, arrived on the scene and are immediately perplexed by this finding of a leg. The detectives do what any 1940s detective would do, and they start to call local hospitals to find out if anyone had been missing one. This being their first course of action makes a bit of sense, but it's undoubtedly absurd. Alas, all local hospitals confirmed there had been no recent amputations or missing legs from their bodily waste disposal. The detectives then sent the leg to Dr. Emerson Ham, the local coroner. Upon an extensive inspection of the lone leg, Ham determines that the leg most certainly belongs to a white man, likely somewhere between the ages of 25 and 35. He also surmises that the owner of the leg weighed about 180 pounds and that his loss of his leg was quite recent, within the past 10 days. He also notes that the removal of the leg was not done surgically, something he could tell with his bare eyes. If there's a leg, there should be more body parts somewhere in this area of Savannah. So the police set out for a search for the rest of the body parts, and initially, they were unsuccessful. They did find something else that would certainly prove to be interesting though. They found two large blood-soaked bags in a vacant lot on 41st Street. Trash bags and paper bags can be bought at literally any store, like ever. But these bags were special bags. They were produced and only used by a company called Union Bag Company. So the police, being the smart cookies that they are, think, well, maybe the killer ought to be an employee at the Union Bag Company, but more on that later. For now, they need to figure out who the hell this leg belongs to, so they start sifting through missing persons reports, and one catches their eye. 17-year-old George Luther Aids, who went by Luther. He had been missing from his home for about 10 days since October 8th. Thinking this could be their victim, the police head to the Aids family home to talk to Luther's parents. The Aids lived at 819 East 36th Street, very close to where the leg was found, really only a few blocks. Luther's parents were George and Dahlia Aids, a well-to-do Savannah family. Dahlia was a homemaker, taking care of Luther and his little sister, and a businesswoman. And George worked at a company downtown. They also owned a restaurant and a package shop on the corner of Bay Street. Detectives McCarthy and Brennan knock on the front door and are greeted by two parents who are clearly distraught at the absence of their son, but also not as worried as you may think they would be. They tell the detectives they last saw their son on Sunday, 10 days prior. At first, they didn't think much of his absence because Luther was 17 and as most 17-year-olds feel, he felt the draw of freedom and adulthood. He left for a couple of days at a time quite frequently, but he would usually return by now. This time, it was a bit different. George, Luther's dad, said he let Luther use his car on that Sunday he was last seen, and the next morning when he woke at about 7:30, he noticed his car was back, parked on the street, but when he peeked in Luther's room, there was no sign of him. So the police then questioned who the last person other than George and Dahlia was to see Luther, maybe a friend who had been out with him on Sunday night. Luther's parents immediately told police he was likely with his friend Jesse McKethan, who went by Mac. Jesse was a little bit older than Luther, 4 years his senior at 21 years old. Luther's parents said he and Jesse were best buds and hung out all the time. They also attested to his character, saying he was a very sweet young man. They also mentioned that since Luther's disappearance, Jesse had been coming by their house nearly every hour to see if there were any updates on Luther's whereabouts. He seemed to genuinely care about the well-being of his friend and wanted to know desperately where he was and if he had been found. So the police made their way over to the McKethan household at 1101 East 38th Street, once again very close in proximity to where the leg was found, which consisted of Jesse, his father, and his brothers. Jesse's mom had passed away quite some time ago, along with some of his older brothers. There was a fatal heart condition or abnormality that ran in the family, so many of the McKethans failed to make it into their 50s. Jesse's brothers were also significantly older than him, bearing about a 20-year age gap. The detectives quickly began asking Jesse about Luther, and he told them that he had last seen his friend that same Sunday night Luther's parents referenced. However, Jesse claimed to know a little bit more than he had initially let on, and he told police that he knew Luther had run off with a French teacher from a local vocational school. This is perplexing because if Jesse knew that Luther had run off with a woman and was likely on some romantic rendezvous, why on earth would he show up at Luther's house every day at every hour to see if he had been found? He added onto the story with some more specifics, claiming Luther and the French teacher had fled to North Carolina in a Buick. As aforementioned, this wasn't completely out of character for Luther. Jesse recalled him running off to Florida and South Carolina in the past, but he also began to worry when a significant amount of time had passed and he hadn't heard from his best friend. And Jesse's past wasn't spick and span either. There are very few people who haven't had some sort of run-in with the law, but Jesse had a special inside connection. One of his surviving older brothers worked for the Savannah Police Department, so when a couple of local moms complained about Jesse's behavior toward their children, Jesse's brother just gave him a stern talking to, and then the matter was dropped. But the real question is, what was he doing? It's a bit more odd than you may think. Jesse was in trouble with the neighborhood moms because he had been trying to put kids to sleep by hypnotizing them and rubbing a nerve on the back of their necks. Because of his past encounters and his closeness to Luther and his family, the detectives were, needless to say, a little suspicious of Jesse. After doing a little more digging on him, they also learned that Jesse did indeed work at Union Bag Company, but they had no grounds or evidence to arrest him on, and quite frankly, they didn't want to. They were more inclined to let Jesse do his thing, only they'd be watching at all times, unbeknownst to Jesse. They wanted to see if maybe Jesse would help lead them to the rest of the body parts, which the cops now believed belonged to Luther Aids. The very next day, Jesse showed up at the Aids home while Dahlia was home alone, and suggested that she and him drive around town looking for Luther. She agreed, seeing no harm in doing so, and not yet realizing the police were suspicious of him. So they drive around town for a bit, and there's still no sign of Luther. Jesse and Dahlia return to the Aids home, and before departing, Jesse tells Dahlia he will return tomorrow to look again. When Jesse leaves, he doesn't go home. In fact, he simply goes out to have some drinks with a couple of friends. Nothing harmful, but he does do something strange on his way home. Jesse didn't have a car or a license, but Savannah is a very walkable city, and on his way home, Jesse made a detour through Daffin Park. Daffin Park is a beautiful public park off of Victory Drive in Savannah, and is located right next to Grayson Stadium, where the legendary Savannah Bananas play. The park is large and features a central pond, and within the pond is a small island. Detective Fitzgerald is still telling Jesse, and when Jesse enters the park, he walks directly to the pond and onto the bridge and lingers there for a moment, then heads home. The next morning, Luther's parents went to Jesse's house while they were on their way to the station to talk to Detective McCarthy, and wanted Jesse to come along with them to answer some questions. They arrive and are greeted by Jesse's dad, who says he tried to wake Jesse but was unsuccessful, which is odd. Around 11 a.m., Jesse finally woke up, But instead of going to the police station, he went straight to the aides' home and sat on their front step for over 3 hours and waited for them to return home. When George and Dahlia returned home, Jesse informed them of a newspaper article he had seen that covered the discovery of the dismembered leg, and strangely, he seemed excited as he could talk about it, and talked about the proximity it was found to his house. Then he suggested that they all go over to where it was found and check it out. George and Dahlia reluctantly agree, and they all go over there, and Jesse rushes to the exact spot where the leg was found. Luther's parents found his fascination with the dismembered leg very unsettling. Jesse then roamed around and searched through the grass for more body parts, and George began to suspect Jesse may have something to do with the leg or the disappearance of his son, or perhaps both. So he talked loudly to his wife, loud enough for Jesse to hear, and said that whoever drove the car home that Sunday night was most certainly not Luther, because it was parked sideways to the curb and sticking out in the middle of the street. He said that, because of this, the driver didn't know how to drive. George knew Jesse did not know how to drive and wanted Jesse to know that he was onto him. However, Jesse simply pretended to not hear George and kept on searching through the grass for more body parts. George and Dahlia watched him closely, and when Jesse's search proved unsuccessful, they suggested that they go to the police station so George could look at the leg and determine if it belonged to his son or not. So Jesse and Dahlia drive home while George heads to the police station to check out the leg, because George wanted to protect his wife from the gruesome nature of the visit. And on the ride home, Jesse and Dahlia have quite the conversation. Jesse asked her if she remembers a news story from a couple years ago about a woman who had killed her husband for his insurance money, and she got away with it. Dahlia says she remembers that, and then Jesse follows by asking how much money Mr. Aids has in his life insurance policy. Dahlia is stunned and tells Jesse that she isn't quite sure, and Jesse responds by suggesting that the two of them killed George for the insurance money. Dahlia is in complete shock by the suggestion and asks Jesse why he would say such a horrible thing, and Jesse says he wants to because he knows that George suspects that Jesse had something to do with Luther's disappearance. Dahlia, at a loss for words, just drops Jesse back off at his home and tells him he's being foolish, and she heads home to wait for her husband to return. A little while later, George calls Dahlia at home and tells her that the leg does not belong to their son. However, George actually thought the exact opposite and believed the leg was Luther's, and he just didn't want to upset his wife even more than she already was. The following day, while George was at work, Jesse went and visited Dahlia with his friend Carol Hendricks. Now, simply for clarification reasons, Carol was a male. Carol and Jesse explained to Dahlia that they were with Luther on Sunday night and that Luther took them both home and told them he had a date with a French teacher. It's speculated that Jesse brought Carol along to corroborate his story to Luther's parents, so that maybe they would stop looking at him so hard. Then the two boys tell Dahlia that they know of a fortune teller out in Port Wentworth who is great at finding things out that no one else can, and they suggest they go visit her and see if she can figure out where Luther is. Dahlia agrees, desperate to try anything to help bring her son home. So she and her daughter Margaret get in the car along with Jesse and Carol and start to head out to Port Wentworth. Dahlia, the driver, decided she would stop at George's office on their way out of town to let her husband know where she was going, and George was simply not having it. He tells Dahlia that there is no way in hell she is riding out to Port Wentworth, about 40 minutes outside of Savannah, with Jesse. George feels with sheer certainty that Jesse had something to do with Luther's disappearance at this point, and he goes to the car and tells Jesse and Carol that they need to take the bus home and that Dahlia and Margaret aren't going anywhere with the pair of them. They all part ways, and Jesse and Carol stop at a bar on their way home to have a few drinks with some friends. They're all having a good time until Jesse suggests they all go to the lot where the leg was found. They all agree and make their way to the vacant Midtown lot, and Jesse excitedly bounces around, pointing out where the leg was found like a kid on Christmas. Jesse's friends, whom he brought with, are completely weirded out by his behavior, and they leave Jesse at the lot. Now alone, Jesse begins to walk home, but once again makes a detour at Daffin Park and stands on the bridge above the water and lingers for just a little too long. The next day, Detectives Fitzgerald, Brennan, and Perkins stop at the McKethan residence and ask if Jesse will come for a ride with them so they can talk about Luther. Jesse agrees, insinuating he has nothing to hide, and the detectives drive off with Jesse in tow and park under a large oak tree. They look to Jesse and ask him to just tell them the whole story, and that was all it took. Jesse told them a simply horrifying recount of what really happened that one Sunday night. Jesse tells Fitzgerald, Brennan, and Perkins that on October 7th, 1945, Luther came to pick him up and took him and his cousin out to Bonaventure Cemetery so they could visit Jesse's mom's grave. After leaving the cemetery, they rode around for a while, dropped Jesse's cousin off, and then landed at a bar on Abercorn Street called the Gold Star Ranch. They hung out there for a bit and had a few drinks, and then Luther left to take a young woman home, later returning to the bar to collect Jesse. Luther then took Jesse home, and they sat in the car outside his house for quite a while, just chatting as good friends would. At some point during their conversation, Luther took out his wallet and Jesse noticed a photo of another boy in it. Seeing this photo sent Jesse into an immediate rage. He said he had lost his wallet previously and that the photo that Luther had belonged to him, and he accused Luther of having stolen it. Jesse grew angrier and angrier, and Luther tried to calm him down and touched him on the back of the head, but that only made Jesse angrier. He dragged Luther out of the car and grabbed a nearby object and bashed it over Luther's head. Luther was reduced to the pavement after the hit, and Jesse then climbed atop him and strangled him until Luther stopped moving entirely. Realizing what he had done, Jesse immediately began to panic and started running up and down the street, trying to figure out what he was going to do next. He returned to Luther's body and listened for a heartbeat, but there was nothing. Then, he says, he dragged Luther's body beside his house and checked again for a heartbeat, but, of course, Luther was likely dead. Jesse then did the only thing he could think to do. He dragged Luther's body into the crawlspace beneath the house, went inside, grabbed a pillow, and then placed it under Luther's head. Jesse said he was exhausted by this point, so he left Luther under the house and went inside to go to bed. The detectives sit listening to Jesse spill his guts under minimal pressure, but all of this still doesn't explain the leg, so they ask Jesse, "What did you do with the body after that?" Jesse tells them he didn't know what to do, so when he woke up, he went to a store downtown and purchased a detective magazine in hopes of finding an article within it. Potentially, this would tell him how to dispose of a body. He, of course, found no such article and just decided to go about his day, and he headed to work at the Union Bag Company. Around 8:30 p.m., he returned home from work, and he knew he had to do something with Luther's body, so he went back under the house to look at his alleged best friend, and something that would make even those with the strongest of stomachs retch happened. Luther groaned. Now, this could have meant there was still some possibility of life and brain activity within Luther, or it could have simply been his body passing gas post-mortem. Either way, Jesse was not having it, and he retrieved a hatchet, a knife, and a flashlight, and made a circular cut around Luther's head, and then, using the hatchet, chopped Luther's head off, decapitating him. Jesse recalled blood spattering everywhere, and said he simply couldn't take it all, so he had to take a walk around the block. After he had, no pun intended, cleared his head, Jesse returned to his beheaded best friend and proceeded to chop off his arm and leg as well. Around 11:30 p.m., Jesse said he heard his dad come home and he knew he had to get rid of the body. After all, what kind of person would leave their dismembered best friend under their house? He told the detectives he put Luther's body parts into bags he brought home from work and began walking. He said that while he was walking on the sidewalk, the body parts fell out of the bag and onto the sidewalk, and that he gathered them up again and kept walking. The image of Jesse dropping all of Luther's body parts onto the sidewalk and talking about it as if it was just a grocery bag is a gruesome image. After this, he continued walking but said the torso was exceedingly heavy, so he could only make it to 39th Street while holding it. So he stopped there and tossed Luther's torso into a ditch. He continued on, throwing one leg into the vacant lot on 38th Street and the other leg into a vacant lot on 36th Street. Jesse continued his obscene adventure towards Daffin Park, where he planned to throw the arms and head into the water, but he determined that the water was too shallow, so he grabbed Luther's head by his hair and chucked it onto the small island in the center of the park's pond. He then did the same with the arms. Then, casual as ever, he told the cops he was really tired, so he just discarded the bloody bags randomly during his walk home. It seems as though he cared more about solving his sleepiness than trying to continue covering up his murder. Now that the detectives had the actual whole story, they immediately took Jesse into custody, and in classic Savannah nature, the story spread like wildfire. As Jesse exited the cop car, he was cool as a cucumber as reporters snapped photos. With Jesse now securely in custody, the detectives set out to recover the rest of Luther's body parts. When they arrived at Daffin Park, a small crowd had already formed. In that crowd were Mr. George and Mrs. Dahlia Aids. The police had yet to even inform them they had seemingly heard the news from the grapevine. It's reported, although it could simply be the 1940s press sensationalizing, that when cops retrieved the head of Luther, they held it up by the hair for the crowd to view like a prize, and Dahlia collapsed into the arms of a friend at the sight of her son's decapitated head. After this, the police head to Jesse's house and look into the crawlspace. It is an absolute horror scene. There's blood everywhere, and an intense smell of creolin is present. Creolin is an exceedingly strong disinfectant that has an intense and distinct smell. Remember how Jesse kept going to all the places where the body parts were? Yeah, he was spreading creolin on the body parts to cover up the smell of decomposition. The cops then found Luther's bloodied clothes, the knife, the hatchet, and even the detective magazine Jesse had purchased. Although there's still something that just isn't adding up though. Why on earth would Jesse be compelled to kill his best friend over something as silly as a photo? Jesse says he has no clue why he did it, and many people attested to Jesse's character, saying he was always kind and well-mannered. He told cops he loved Luther. Jesse confessed he had no desire sexually for either women or men, but he did have special affections for young boys, the cherry on top of an already horrifying sequence of events. It could be speculated that Jesse had these feelings towards Luther because he told detectives that Jesse had recently been scorned by Luther when Luther ran off to Florida without Jesse. Luther reportedly had a girlfriend, so they weren't in a romantic relationship that anyone was aware of, but it definitely seemed as though Jesse had some sort of volatile infatuation with Luther. While it's simply undeniable that Jesse had some serious internal problems, they likely stemmed from his childhood. He didn't have the greatest of upbringings. As aforementioned, Jesse's mom and most of his brothers passed away at very young ages, which is damaging to any individual. But when Jesse was only 4 years old, he fell out of a third-story window and nearly died. He sustained a serious head injury that left a sunken spot on the back of his skull that was visible to the naked eye and could easily be felt. As Jesse grew up, if anyone touched that sunken spot on his head, he would fly into an uncontrollable rage. It was like he turned into a completely different person when that spot was touched. One time, one of Jesse's brothers had playfully tapped the back of his head, and Jesse went into such a rage that he smashed a table over his brother's head. Doctors attested that he had at least 3 other separate similar episodes of this rage, and Jesse claimed he had no recollection of his actions during these episodes. Now, just to recall, Luther touched the back of Jesse's head just before the killing occurred, which, of course, does not exonerate Jesse, but perhaps it provides some insight into why the night went the way it did. Jesse was charged with first-degree murder of George Luther Aids and was sentenced to death by electrocution. Jesse's only course of action to prevent his execution was to plead guilty by reason of insanity. And the cops think that they may not be too far off from the truth. They brought 2 doctors to the jail to examine Jesse's mental health. The following is the testimony of the first doctor, Dr. Edwin Whalen, who was Jesse's primary care physician. Dr. Whalen said, "I am a graduate of the University of Georgia and Georgetown University. Frankly, I may be permitted to say so. I do not think he is a lunatic. Insofar as we judge lunatics, he is a menace to society due to a physical defect brought about through no fault of his own. It is one of those things that could happen to any of us. My personal view is he should be under permanent guard and made to work and be of some use to the state. That is working upon the assumption that this killing he did was the result of a blackout, and if he killed this boy without any blackout, he would be guilty of murder." Now, notice how he won't use the word insane. That's the word the court needs to hear. The second doctor, decorated scholar Hervey Cleckley, gave a much more detailed testimony, explaining his view on the entirety of the case. He says, "The x-ray shows an old fracture. You can see the depression here on the left side of the skull. The right knee jerk was very much greater than the left knee jerk, and the right ankle jerk was slightly greater than the left. This does not prove but strongly suggest some abnormality from the area of the brain to the spinal cord. That is a test always made to determine a person's mental condition. He talked to me about his life, stating that he had gotten along fairly well at work, about his unhappiness at home due to a great deal of drinking in the family on the part of his father and brothers. The household apparently was not a very happy one from what I can judge of his own account. He apparently had been arrested once or twice for small matters, such as cashing small checks that were not his. He had shifted jobs quite frequently, and I was particularly impressed by his lack of ordinary sex feelings. According to his own statement, he had no sex impulses towards women or men, and considering the details of his actions before the killing of his friend and afterwards, I was impressed with the statement that when he saw the picture of another young man in the pocketbook of his friend, the deceased, he argued with him upon the point as to how he came about the picture, which he stated he had lost his wallet some months ago. What impressed me was a sort of concern which perhaps does not come through as bare recital of fact, but from the attitude I could sense in him, a rather unusual degree of attachment towards the male and the lack of impulse towards women. He said he became totally unconscious and had no memory of any struggle after the first blow or two were passed until he awoke and found his friend dead, apparently strangled. Then he spoke of matters which impressed me as exceptional, such as pulling the body under the house and leaving it there overnight, and I was struck by his calmness and by his apparent lack of deep emotion. I got the impression, which is only an impression since I was not there, that he was calm during that night. He spoke of getting the knife and hatchet and cutting the body up, dismembering it, and at one point that stood out was his lack of ordinary precaution in his distribution of the body. One would think that the average man would seek to hide parts of the body where they could not be found. It struck me not only as careless but decidedly abnormal. I was also impressed with the statement that he had gone to the mother of the deceased and talked with her, apparently showing no sign of strain or anxiety, and had gone in an automobile with her to some place where they served drinks and beer. He seemed rather content in jail, and the impression I got was that he did not experience what a normal person would experience under such circumstances. I would say he was free of any delusions, though he spoke reasonably and rationally, expressing himself as regretting the deed. I got a strong impression that it was just a mask, not a temporarily assumed mask, but that his actual emotion reactions were rather trivial and not nearly as intense as one would expect in regards to ordinary feelings. That was the one impression I got from the examination of him in jail. I had access to a report describing his life in the past, which, in general, confirmed the things he told me. There were reports stating he would spend large sums of money on boys younger than himself. I was impressed by the fact that the report confirmed his account of the unhappy household in which he was raised, the maladjustment of the father, and reports of previous attacks in which he would lose control of himself, and he told me this too, and of that instance that occurred while at work in which he suddenly lost control of himself and broke things up in the office. The incident about his brother, as I recall, was mentioned in the report I saw. A person subject to epileptic fits may have convulsions, or he may fall into a totally unconscious state and become violently destructive towards anyone present. You would temporarily be unconscious. I am not convinced that this is true. In this case, I think there is a chance of that. I would think, however, to determine that as a very strong probability, he would be more likely to have had more spells of convulsions, having reports only 3 times. His lack of capacity for remorse or grief entirely different from normal for persons of that sort. We usually make the classification psychopathic personality, although he was not typical of psychopathic personality, as it is usually understood. It is generally considered as applying to a person who has emotional or mental differences from the normal, consisting in an incapacity to feel what others feel. I feel McKethan can express a difference between right and wrong in words, but not in the full sense. I do not get the impression that he wholeheartedly participates, feels the significance in matters of right and wrong, or what is desirable or undesirable, as the normal or average man does. I will say he is abnormal. Insane is not a medical term, and whether or not he should be put under the category is debatable. He is not totally responsible for his acts, and at the same time, he is not totally irresponsible. I feel that on occasion, he would be more likely than the average man to give way to an act of violence. That does not mean he would do it out of pure madness or meanness, but he just can't help himself. And once again, Dr. Cleckley refrains from the word insane. After hearing the doctor's testimonies, many others took the stand. They vouched for Jesse's kind-heartedness and his previous lack of violence. When it was finally Jesse's turn to speak, he addressed the court, proclaiming his innocence. He said, "They say I killed him. If I did, I was not mentally responsible at the time. I have a clean conscience, as I did not know what I was doing when I killed him." This is interesting though, because if he was claiming he was in a blackout when the killing occurred, what does he have to say about the following days when he attempted, albeit poorly, to cover up his tracks? It seems as though the jury came to this same conclusion because he was found to be guilty of the murder of Luther and sentenced, once again, to death by electrocution. The date of his death was set for March 8th, 1946. Jesse's lawyer did appeal the case, but it was denied. All it did was put off the execution by a few months. In July, as Jesse was on his way to the electric chair, he said, "I found the Lord and I'm ready to go. I feel I am saved. I am sorry that it had to be so late and this way, but otherwise, I may not have been saved." Jesse and Luther are both buried in Bonaventure Cemetery. Jesse's grave is unmarked, but you can tell where he lies based on his family's plot marker. Whether or not Jesse was insane was never proved. But there is something quite interesting about the idea that a switch could be flipped when a certain part of his skull was touched. What lingers after this story is not only the violence, but the ordinariness that framed it. A quiet walk, a familiar block, a city that trusted its routines to hold. The investigation forced Savannah to look closely at places that once felt simple and safe. Neighbors learned how easily certainty can slip and how quickly a community must choose patience over rumor. The case did not grow famous, yet it shaped the way streets were watched and how questions were asked. It reminded us that truth is not delivered all at once. It is built slowly, testimony by testimony, until the shape finally appears. We carry these stories so the people inside them did not vanish twice. Luther deserves to be remembered as a son and a friend, not just a victim in a headline. The officers, the families, and the neighbors earned their place in the record by showing up when the work turned hard. If there is a lesson to learn here, it might be this. Pay attention to the small shifts in your world and treat the quiet details with care. Let evidence lead, protect your compassion, and leave space for grief that has no hurry. I'm Joshua John with Behind the Headlines, and until next time, stay safe.